Eva Johnson stepped into the courtroom, her heart pounding yet her composure was unshakable. The thick air in the room seemed to hold its breath as she walked to the defendant's seat, her heels kicking sharply against the floor. Her presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere around her. The spectators eyed her with a mix of curiosity and judgment, as if waiting for her to crack or to show any hint of fear. She met their gazes with unwavering resolve, her posture straight and her chin held high. The faint hum of whispers filled the courtroom before settling into an eerie silence. Her case was far from ordinary. Ava knew this was no simple legal matter. This was a battle that transcended the four walls of the courtroom. It was a struggle for justice, a clash of ideals, the kind of case that would define her as more than just a defendant, but a symbol of something larger than herself. Judge Matthews sat at the bench, staring down at the papers in front of him, his face stern and unreadable. He was no stranger to difficult cases, yet something about this one unsettled him. He had heard of Ava Johnson and her activism. Her name had echoed through the media for months. She was a leader of the movement demanding justice for marginalized communities. She had marched, protested, and spoken out against the systemic racism that plagued their society. She was fierce, determined, and had garnered the attention of both allies and adversaries alike. But here she was in his courtroom, accused of disrupting a protest, a charge that might seem trivial to some, but one that demanded a decision nonetheless. Ava's supporters filled the back of the room, their faces a mix of hope and worry. They had been with her through every protest, every march. They knew what was at stake today, but none of them could predict how it would unfold. Judge Matthews was known for his rigid adherence to the law. He had built his reputation on upholding the rules regardless of public opinion or personal sentiment. He had the power to decide Ava's fate today, and he intended to use it, whether or not he fully understood the complexity of her actions. The prosecutor stood ready to present the case against Ava, his voice carrying authority. As he spoke to the court, his words clear and calculated. As he described the events of the protest Ava had attended, he painted a picture of chaos, of disorder, and disobedience, framing Ava as a disruptive force in an attempt to maintain public order. His argument was simple and direct. She had broken the law and must be held accountable. The words felt cold to Ava's ears, as if he had no understanding of what she was fighting for or why the protest had been necessary. Ava remained quiet throughout the prosecutor's speech, her face betraying no emotion. She had heard these arguments before. She had stood in front of powerful figures many times, and each time she had faced them with the same unyielding conviction. This was no different. Her cause was just, and she would not be intimidated by anyone who failed to see that. As her lawyer prepared to speak, Ava knew this moment was not just about defending her actions. It was about something bigger, about showing the world that the fight for justice could not be silenced by legal systems built to protect the status quo. Her heart beat faster, but she was ready. She would not back down, no matter the cost. The prosecutor finished his statement and sat down. The room remained still as all eyes turned toward Ava. Her lawyer stood beside her, ready to begin his defense. But Ava raised her hand, signaling for him to step back. She had something to say. This was her moment to speak for herself, to address not just the court, but the world. She had made up her mind that she wouldn't let anyone tell her story except for her own. The weight of the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, as everyone awaited her words. Ava stood slowly, her hands resting by her sides, her breath deep and steady as she faced Judge Matthews, her gaze unwavering. As she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried a power that filled the room. Every eye was locked on her. Her words were deliberate, each one chosen carefully. She began by explaining why she had been at the protest that day. She spoke of the systemic racism that had taken root in their society, of the countless lives lost to injustice, of the mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters who had been denied justice for far too long. She spoke of the pain that echoed through the streets, the frustration that had built up over years of oppression. She spoke not just for herself, but for those who could not speak for themselves, whose voices had been silenced by a system that was built to ignore them. Ava's eyes briefly flickered to the judge. As she continued, she could see the skepticism in his expression, the way he narrowed his eyes, as if trying to decipher her motives. But she wasn't deterred. She had learned long ago that change didn't come from silence or appeasement. It came from standing up even when it felt impossible, from speaking out even when the consequences seemed dire. She turned back to the court and addressed the prosecutor without hesitation. She didn't see him as an adversary, but as a part of the system that had failed so many people like her. She acknowledged his role in enforcing the law, but she also made it clear that the law was not infallible. It could be unjust, it could be harmful, and sometimes it was the law that needed to change, not the people fighting against it. She reminded the court that the greatest movements in history had started with acts of civil disobedience, when people refused to accept the status quo, when they chose to rise up against the system that oppressed them. The room seemed to shift as Ava spoke. Her words resonated with some of the spectators in the back, who nodded in agreement. Others remained still, their faces unreadable. But Ava could feel the impact of her message. It was sinking in, even if only a little. She wasn't just defending her actions, she was making a statement. She was challenging the system that had been designed to keep people like her down, to silence their voices. And now she was asking the court to hear her, not as a defendant, not as someone to be punished, but as a human being who had a right to speak and to fight for what was right. As she finished her speech, Ava took a step back. Her heart was racing, but she stood tall. She knew that what she had just said couldn't be undone. It was out in the open now. The judge would have to reckon with her words. The prosecutor would have to face the truth she had laid before them all. And for the first time in the courtroom, there was a palpable sense of uncertainty. It was as if the very foundations of the trial were beginning to shift. Judge Matthews sat back in his chair, his fingers pressed against his temples as he processed Ava's words. The room was still, but the tension was thick. As he tried to steady his thoughts, the case had taken a turn he had not anticipated until now. He had only seen Ava Johnson as the accused, a person who had broken the law, a person who had disrupted the order of things. But now he was beginning to question everything he had assumed about her. Her speech had shaken him more than he cared to admit. His eyes briefly flickered to the prosecutor, who seemed unmoved by Ava's passionate defense, his posture rigid, as if determined to press on with the case no matter what. The prosecutor stood up again, ready to continue with his argument, but there was a hesitation in his step, a slight falter in his voice. As he faced the judge, the air in the courtroom felt heavier now. The words of the defense had lingered, and he had no choice but to acknowledge the discomfort that had settled over him. Ava had made a compelling case, but he was determined not to let it sway. His goal was clear: the law had been broken, and he believed that the punishment needed to be enforced, no matter the context, no matter the reason behind the protest. Ava sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the judge. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper to her, but she shook her head. She knew this was her battle. She had made her stand, and now she would wait for the decision. She had hoped for change. She had hoped that the judge would see her for who she truly was, but she also knew that the road ahead was not going to be easy. She was prepared for whatever came next. She had fought too long for justice to turn back now. Judge Matthews shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the prosecutor made his case, his voice becoming more forceful with each passing word. But even as the prosecutor spoke, the judge found it difficult to ignore the growing sense of doubt that had taken root within him. He glanced at Ava once more, her expression calm, yet resolute. Her confidence was palpable. She had stood up to him without fear, and in that moment he couldn't help but wonder if he was the one who had been blinded by the law's strictures, instead of truly seeing the bigger picture, the true purpose of justice. He began to recall the many times he had ruled with such certainty, and yet each time there had been some part of him that felt unsure about whether his decisions had always been right. He thought of the cases where he had upheld laws that had harmed innocent people, and now he was confronted with a woman who was fighting not only for her rights, but for the rights of countless others who had been oppressed and silenced for far too long. The weight of that realization pressed down on him with an intensity he hadn't expected. The room was growing more restless as the minutes ticked by, and the judge still had not spoken. The prosecutor eyed him warily, wondering if he had lost his edge. But Ava remained calm, her heart beating steadily as she waited for the ruling. She knew that what had just transpired in the courtroom was significant, no matter the outcome. This was a pivotal moment in her journey, a moment that would define her, and the fight she was part of. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Judge Matthews spoke, his voice steady, but there was a shift in it, a softness that hadn't been there before. He cleared his throat and turned his attention to Ava. The silence stretched out just a moment longer before he addressed the court, his words breaking through the stillness. Judge Matthews took a deep breath, his fingers still pressed lightly against his temple. As he stared down at the papers in front of him for a moment, it seemed as though he was grappling with the weight of the decision that was about to come. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Everyone held their breath, waiting to hear what he would say. But the judge took his time, as if the words he had to speak were not just for the courtroom, but for himself as well. He had listened to Ava's speech carefully, and it had done more than just challenge his view of the case. It had shaken something deeper within him, a sense of doubt he had long buried beneath his need for order and procedure. Finally he spoke, his voice steady, but with an unexpected softness. "Your actions, Ms. Johnson, have caused disruption in this courtroom, and the charges against you remain serious. But it is clear to me that you are not here for the same reasons as most defendants in this room. You have not come to this court simply to argue your innocence, but to make a point that goes beyond the law itself." He paused for a moment, his gaze locking with Ava's, as if trying to fully grasp the depth of what she had said about her fight for justice and equality. Ava felt a shift in the air. She had expected some kind of condemnation or even dismissal of her actions, but instead, the judge's words felt like an acknowledgement, a recognition of her cause. She couldn't help but hold her breath as she waited for him to continue. Her heart raced in anticipation as the room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for what would come next. Judge Matthews continued, "You have shown me that the law is not always clear-cut, that sometimes justice cannot be measured simply by what is written on paper, but by what is felt in the hearts of those who fight for it. You are a person of conviction, Ms. Johnson, and your cause is one that deserves attention, but that does not excuse the actions you took that day, nor can I ignore the potential harm caused by the disruption to public order. The law must still be upheld." Ava's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she had hoped for some measure of understanding, but she hadn't expected the judge to acknowledge her struggle in such a way. His words were still difficult to process. He wasn't dismissing her, but he wasn't fully exonerating her either. He was walking a fine line, and Ava could feel the tension building within her as she tried to make sense of the balance he was trying to strike. Judge Matthews' gaze shifted briefly to the prosecutor, who remained seated, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. The prosecutor's face was hard to read, but Ava could sense the frustration boiling beneath the surface. The judge was clearly taking his time, and that uncertainty was unsettling to the prosecutor, who had hoped for a swift resolution to the case. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke again. "I have made my decision, Ms. Johnson. You will not face the fine originally proposed," he said, and the room seemed to exhale collectively. A wave of murmurs rippling through the courtroom. Ava's supporters in the back of the room exchanged looks of surprise and relief. But the judge wasn't finished. He looked back at her, his eyes steady and filled with a quiet gravity. "But you will be required to engage in a program that promotes dialogue and understanding about the issues you have brought to the forefront today." He added, "This will be a condition of your release." Ava stood still, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this outcome. She had come into the courtroom prepared for the worst, but now it seemed she had been given something more than just a reprieve. She had been given a platform, a chance to continue her fight, but through a different avenue, something that would force others to engage with her cause, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. Ava stood there, stunned, her mind racing, as she processed Judge Matthews' words. She had come into the courtroom expecting a different outcome, maybe even a harsh ruling, but now she was given an unexpected opportunity, a chance to continue her activism through a program that would force others to listen and understand her cause. The weight of what had just been said settled over her like a heavy blanket. But she couldn't allow herself to show weakness, not now, not after everything she had fought, for she stood tall, her gaze unwavering. As she met the judge's eyes, her heart still pounding in her chest. The prosecutor remained silent, his arms still crossed, as he processed the judge's decision. It was clear that he hadn't expected such a ruling either. His face was a mix of frustration and disbelief. He had expected the law to be upheld without question. But here he was watching as Ava was given a second chance, a chance that many would say she didn't deserve. Yet Ava knew that this wasn't just a simple reprieve, it was something much larger. This was a moment that would shape the trajectory of her movement. This was the court's acknowledgement of something deeper, something that the system had long ignored, the very injustice she had been fighting against. Judge Matthews cleared his throat as he addressed the court. Once more, I know this decision may seem unusual, but I believe it is the right one, he said, his voice firm, though the weight of his words hung in the air. I have come to realize that this case is not just about the law, it is about something bigger than any of us. It is about the world we live in, and the injustices that persist despite the laws meant to protect us. We cannot ignore the voices that demand change, nor can we silence those who fight for what is right. Ava's supporters began to stir in the back of the room. Whispers of relief and approval rippled through the crowd, but Ava remained still, her eyes never leaving the judge. As he spoke, she had never expected this kind of recognition from a court that was often the very instrument used to silence voices like hers. And yet here she was being heard, in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had won a small victory today, but it was a victory nonetheless. It was a sign that perhaps the tide was beginning to turn, that maybe people were starting to listen. Judge Matthews' gaze softened as he turned back to Ava. You will be required to participate in this program and demonstrate a commitment to engaging with others who may not share your views, he said. This is not a punishment, but an opportunity to continue the conversation in a meaningful way. This is your chance to show that your fight for justice does not end in the streets, but extends into every part of society and every aspect of our lives. Ava nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the decision. She had been given a chance not just to fight for change, but to lead others toward understanding. She could already imagine the faces of those who would be part of the program. Some of them would resist, some would refuse to listen, but Ava was ready. She had always been ready to challenge the system. And now she had the chance to do it on a larger scale, to bridge the gap between people who didn't understand and those who were ready to make a difference. As she turned to leave the courtroom, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew this wasn't the end of her fight, far from it, but it was a new beginning, a new chapter in her journey, a journey that had taken her from the streets to the courtroom, and now into the heart of the system itself. She walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, her supporters trailing behind her as the echoes of the judge's words continued to resonate in the air. And she knew deep down that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than herself. As Ava left the courtroom, her mind buzzed with a mixture of emotions. A strange sense of accomplishment swirled within her, but it was quickly tempered by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She had been granted an opportunity, one that she hadn't expected, but still she couldn't help but feel that the real challenge was just beginning. She had to step into a new role, one that would force her to engage with people who might never understand her cause or the reasons behind her actions, yet she was determined to face it head-on. Her supporters surrounded her as she walked down the hall, their faces a mix of joy and disbelief. They had expected the worst, but had witnessed something entirely different today. They saw Ava not just as a symbol of resistance, but as someone who had been heard by the very system that had always tried to silence her. They were proud of her, but they also knew this new path wouldn't be easy. They had seen the challenges Ava had faced before, the pushback, the resistance, the harsh judgment from those who disagreed with her. Her fight had never been simple, and this new chapter would be no different. Ava looked at them one by one, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had always known that she wasn't alone in this fight, that her strength came from the collective power of those who stood with her. But now she felt the connection even more deeply. She had come to this courtroom alone, but she wasn't leaving alone, and that gave her hope. As she stepped into the unknown, she wasn't walking into it blindly. She had her people by her side, and together they could face whatever came next. As they stepped outside into the bright sunlight, Ava took a deep breath. She hadn't realized how much the weight of the courtroom had been pressing on her. Until now, the fresh air seemed to lift some of the tension from her shoulders. But there was still a heaviness that lingered. The ruling had been a victory, but it wasn't the end. She knew that the road ahead would be just as challenging as the one that had brought her here today. She could already feel the eyes of the world on her. Those who had watched the trial unfold would be waiting to see what she did next. They would judge her every move, and scrutinized her actions with a fine-tooth comb. But Ava was ready for it. She had always been ready to face the criticism, the hate, the misunderstandings. She had spent years fighting for justice. And this was just another part of that fight. She glanced at the program. She would be required to participate in. The thought of it made her uneasy. The idea of sitting down with people who were directly opposed to everything she stood for didn't sit well with her, but she understood the necessity of it. She knew that change wouldn't come if people remained in their silos. If they continued to talk only to those who agreed with them, she had to step into the uncomfortable spaces. If she wanted to make a real difference, if she wanted to build bridges instead of walls. The program would be a challenge, she knew that, but she also knew it was a chance to reach people who might never have considered her perspective before. Maybe through dialogue and engagement, they could begin to understand that what she was fighting for wasn't just about her, it was about a future where justice and equality were available to everyone, no matter their race, their background, their economic status. Ava took another deep breath as she stepped forward, ready for the next part of her journey, ready for whatever would come her way, because she knew that every step she took was a step toward a world where her fight and the fight of so many others would be heard and seen. As Ava walked away from the courthouse, the weight of her decision still heavy on her shoulders, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real work was about to begin. She had always fought against the system, but now she was being asked to work within it, in a way that felt foreign to her. How could she change something from the inside when the very system she was part of had been built to keep her and people like her down? Her heart raced as doubts crept into her mind. She had spent so long pushing back against the system that now she wondered if this new path would truly bring about the change she had been fighting for. She tried to shake the thoughts away as she made her way to the next phase of her journey. The program would start soon. She had to attend meetings and engage with people who had no understanding of what it meant to fight for justice. They hadn't lived the experiences she had. They hadn't felt the sting of discrimination or the anger of injustice. Yet here she was being told to sit in a room with them and somehow find common ground, find a way to make them see her struggle, and maybe even change their minds. It felt like an impossible task, but Ava knew she couldn't back down. She had always believed in the power of conversation, the power of reaching people who didn't understand, and helping them see through her eyes. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but it was possible, and she had to believe that if she truly wanted to make a difference. She arrived at the first meeting, unsure of what to expect. The room was filled with people, some with stern faces, others with looks of confusion. They sat in silence as she walked in, and for a moment, Ava felt the full weight of what she was about to do. She was in a room full of strangers, people who might never accept her perspective. But she had to try. She couldn't just walk away from this opportunity, even if it meant facing hostility or indifference. She had to keep pushing forward. The facilitator of the program greeted her with a professional smile and ushered her to a seat. She sat down and glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of the others. They were all waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to explain herself, to justify her actions in a way that made sense to them. They didn't know her story. They didn't understand why she had taken the stand she had. They hadn't felt the years of pain and frustration that had led her to this moment, and now she was being asked to make them understand. Ava took a deep breath and began speaking, not just about her actions, but about the movement. She was part of the struggle that had led her to this point. She spoke of the people she had met along the way, the ones whose lives had been forever changed by the injustices they faced. She spoke of the dreams she had for a better future, one where people of all backgrounds could live without fear, and where equality was not just a dream, but a reality. Some of the people in the room looked uncomfortable, their eyes darting around as if trying to avoid the weight of her words, but Ava didn't falter. She continued speaking from the heart. And slowly she began to see a shift. Some of them started to listen not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Others began to nod slowly, their faces softening, as they heard her story in a way they hadn't expected. Maybe for the first time they were beginning to understand that her fight wasn't just about her, it was about something much larger than themselves. By the end of the meeting, the room felt different, quieter but more open. There was no sudden agreement, no immediate change of hearts. But there was a sense that something had shifted, and that was all Ava needed for now. A small crack in the wall that she could keep working to widen, she left the room feeling a mixture of exhaustion and hope, because she knew that this was just the beginning, and every step forward, no matter how small, mattered in the end. Over the next few weeks, Ava found herself facing more challenges than she had anticipated. The program was demanding in ways she hadn't expected. The meetings were long and filled with people who often seemed uninterested or dismissive of the very issues she was passionate about. But Alva was determined. She knew that this was a test of her resolve, and she wasn't going to back down, not now, not after everything she had already been through. At first it felt like talking to walls. Each session seemed like a repeat of the last, with people who couldn't see past their own biases or preconceptions. They would sit in silence or offer polite nods, but no real engagement. Sometimes Ava felt like she was speaking into the void. But she refused to give up. She knew that change wasn't instant, it wasn't easy, and it wasn't always visible on the surface. One day after another particularly frustrating session, Ava stayed behind. As the room emptied, she sat at the table alone, her mind swirling with thoughts of how to reach these people, how to break through the walls they had built around themselves. She knew the program wasn't going to change the world overnight, but it was a starting point, and if she could plant even one seed of understanding, she would consider it a victory. As she gathered her things to leave, she heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see one of the participants from the group, a man in his late 40s, with a stern face and arms crossed, walking toward her. She had noticed him during the meetings, always quiet, rarely engaging with anyone, but today he approached her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I've been listening," he said, his voice low and hesitant. Ava raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. "I mean, I've been listening to what you've been saying," he continued, sitting down across from her for the first time. There was something different in his eyes, something that wasn't there before. It was an openness, a curiosity that she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure what had changed, but in that moment she realized that her words had made an impact, even if it was just on one person. "I don't agree with everything you've said, but I've been thinking about it," he said, looking down at his hands for a moment before meeting her gaze. "I've seen things in my own life that I didn't want to see, things I didn't want to admit. But you're right, this world isn't as fair as we think it is. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm willing to listen more if you're willing to keep talking." Ava felt a surge of emotion rise within her. She wasn't sure how to respond, but she nodded slowly. "I'll keep talking," she said softly, "because that's all we can do sometimes, keep talking, and keep trying to make people see what they might not want to see." For the first time in weeks, Ava felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a crack in the armor, and she would keep pushing to widen it with every conversation, with every person who was willing to listen, and even with those who weren't. She knew this was a long road, but it was a road she was determined to walk one step at a time. As she left the building that day, Ava felt a sense of renewed purpose. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that she had made a difference in one person's life, and that was enough for now. It was a reminder that even small victories mattered, that change could start with just one conversation, and that conversation could lead to something bigger, something that would ultimately change the world. As the weeks went by, Ava continued her participation in the program, and while the progress was slow, she began to notice subtle changes in the way the participants interacted with her. There were still many who resisted her message, who looked at her with skepticism or indifference. But there were others who were beginning to show signs of curiosity. They started to ask questions about her experiences and her fight, and for the first time Ava felt like they were not just hearing her, but actually trying to understand her. One afternoon, as she walked into the meeting room, she noticed a familiar face. One of the women, who had always been quiet during the sessions, was sitting at the table looking at Ava with a thoughtful expression. Ava wasn't sure what to expect, but she had learned by now to approach these moments with patience. So she took her seat and waited for the woman to speak. "You've been talking about your struggle for so long," the woman began, her voice tentative but clear. "I've been listening, and I've been thinking about it, and I want to understand better, but I don't know how to even start. I don't know what to say or where to begin." Ava could see the sincerity in her eyes, the vulnerability in her tone, and she felt a surge of hope. "It's okay," Ava replied gently. "It's hard to know where to start sometimes, but the fact that you're asking means you're already on the right path, asking questions, is the first step toward understanding. And from there, we can keep the conversation going, we can learn from each other. That's what it's all about. The woman nodded slowly as if absorbing Ava's words, and for the rest of the session they talked more than they ever had before. Ava shared stories of her childhood, the moments when she first realized the weight of injustice, and the reasons why she became an activist. The woman listened intently, asking questions and offering her thoughts in return. Ava could see that the conversation was helping her understand things she hadn't even known to ask about, and that felt like a victory in itself. As the weeks turned into months, the sessions became more dynamic and engaging. There were still challenges. There were still moments when Ava felt as though she was running into a wall of resistance. But there were also moments of breakthroughs, small moments of connection, where people would open up and admit that they had never considered the things Ava was talking about before, or that they had been blind to certain injustices in the world. One of the most significant changes was in the group's discussions about privilege, something that Ava had struggled to get across at the beginning of the program. There was a time when many of them had refused to acknowledge their own privilege, or had dismissed it as irrelevant to the conversation. But now, it was a topic that came up regularly in the sessions, and people were beginning to understand the concept in a deeper way. It wasn't just a theory or an abstract idea anymore. It was something that was real and tangible, and it had an impact on their lives. Despite the progress, there were still moments when Ava felt frustrated when the resistance seemed too strong, or the progress too slow, but she had learned not to give up, not to give in to despair. She reminded herself that change took time, and that it wasn't always linear. Sometimes it was messy and unpredictable, but it was happening, and that was what mattered. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult session, where the conversation had stalled and tempers flared, Ava left the building feeling drained. But she was not ready to give up, not yet. She walked to the bus stop and sat on the bench, staring out at the busy street, her thoughts swirling around everything that had happened over the past few months. She had come so far, but there was still so much to do, so much more to fight for. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, she saw the woman from earlier walking down the street toward her, the same woman who had started the conversation all those weeks ago. And as she drew closer, the woman smiled and waved. Ava smiled back, and in that moment she realized that even the smallest steps forward could lead to something big. And maybe that was enough for now. As Ava sat on the bench, watching the woman approach, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of pride. Something small but powerful was happening. She had been part of this program for months now, and while it had been difficult and at times frustrating, there was something undeniably real about the connections she had started to build with others. Even the ones who had initially been resistant or indifferent were beginning to see things differently. Ava had always known that change took time, but now she was starting to believe in it in a way she hadn't before. She had seen the cracks in people's perspectives, and those cracks were widening slowly but surely. The woman sat down beside her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They simply sat in the quiet of the afternoon, watching the world go by. Finally, the woman broke the silence. "You've changed the way I think," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's not just about agreeing with you or understanding everything you say, but I see now that there's more to this than I ever thought. There's more to the fight for justice than I realized. I've been blind to so many things, and I didn't even know it." Ava turned to her and smiled. "That's the start," she said, gently. "Admitting that we don't have all the answers is a huge step. Acknowledging what we've been missing opens the door to understanding. But it doesn't end there. We have to keep looking and listening to the stories that are hard to hear, but that need to be told." The woman nodded, her eyes thoughtful and a little distant, as though she was processing everything Ava had said. "You've been talking about your story for so long," she said, "and I think I've been hearing it, but I never really listened before you made me listen. And that's what matters." Ava felt a wave of emotion rise up in her chest. It wasn't just the woman's words, but the truth in them. Something had shifted between them in that moment, and it was something real, something that couldn't be undone no matter how much time passed. Ava had planted a seed, and now it was starting to grow. And that growth wasn't just for the woman beside her, It was for all of them, for every person she had ever spoken to who was willing to open their hearts and minds to change. They sat together for a little while longer, both lost in their thoughts, before the woman stood up and turned to Ava. "I'm glad I met you," she said with a smile. "I don't know where this road is going, but I feel like I'm on it now. I'm not sure how far I'll go or if I'll ever fully understand everything, but I want to keep trying." Iva stood as well and nodded in agreement. "I'm glad you're on it too," she said. And as they parted ways, she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for this unexpected connection, a connection that had started with a question and had grown into something that could change both their lives in ways they hadn't yet imagined. As Ava walked away from the bench, she looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of everything she had fought for, and everything still left to do. There were still battles to face, still injustices to confront. But she wasn't afraid. She had learned that even in the hardest moments, there were seeds of hope waiting to be planted. And sometimes the smallest actions could have the biggest impact. One conversation, one open heart at a time, was all it took to start the change. And as she moved forward with renewed purpose, Ava knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she was no longer walking it alone.